if you're not the police and not under arrest, I think I'd like you to leave.
You need some help with that? Been a while since you used a door, huh? Oh, I know who you are. I know what you are.
This conversation's over.
This conversation's not over. So you answer my question. Tell me. How'd you last this long, huh? Who's helping you? Jumpers. Kinda hard to jump with 1,000 volts of electricity passing through your brain, huh? Who's protecting you? Give me an answer so I can go home. I hate jumpers. You think you could go on like this forever? Living like this with no consequences? There are always consequences. Where you going, huh? I got you now. You think you can hide behind a wall, go anywhere, do anything? Not anymore!
Welcome to the Superhero Cinephiles podcast. I am your host, Perry Constantine, and welcoming a new guest and a fellow podcaster, and that is Nic Baldwin. Nick, how you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well, Perry. Thanks very much for the invitation to be on this. I saw your blast. I think someone else, one of my past guests, I think actually shared it with me on Twitter, and I was like, ooh, that sounds like right up my alley, talking about our love of superhero movies.
Oh, really? Who was that?
Ooh, Sai Islam, I want to say, is the one who shared it with me.
Yeah. Sai's been on, we've had him on twice so far. In fact, he's scheduled to come back on. We're going to be talking about Ms. Marvel in a few episodes.
Oh, that's even more cool, because I did not realize he'd actually been on. I thought perhaps he just was like, oh, this sounds like something to be up Nick's alley. And so then he shared it with me, maybe having not been on it. As I was just saying to you before we started recording, I have listened to a couple of episodes, but I had not located the one Sai was on, so I will have to go digging through your back catalog even more, Perry, to go find my friend Sai. So.
Him and his co-author on Leaders Assemble, they both came on together to talk about Iron Man 3 the first time, and then Sai alone came on and we discussed Moon Knight, and then he's coming back on alone soon to talk about Ms. Marvel.
Well, even better. Then for your listeners who are debating whether or not to go find my podcast, my wife and I have a podcast. It's called In Love with Movies. So that's In Love and then comma with movies. If you search for that way, either on YouTube or just about any, place you can find podcasts, you'll find Danny and Nick and Danny, and we're the hosts of that. But yeah, we had Sai and Gordon, his co-author for Leaders Assembled, on recently. I actually know Sai and Gordon because I'm in the field of IO psychology with them, what they wrote their book on, leadership. But yeah, they came on, and I want to say it was 4 or 5 episodes ago now in our back catalog. They came on and they talked about, we were talking about Captain America. So if you are a listener who enjoyed listening to Perry talk to Sai and Gordon about Iron Man 3, please, by all means, come find In Love with Movies, and you'll get to hear Gordon and Sai go very deep nerdy into all things comic books when we are discussing Captain America, the First Avenger. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
always very impressed. Both of them have just so much more knowledge than I do when it comes to the actual comic books themselves. But I've probably watched more generic movies than they have. So
that impressed me about them as well, because I got the email from I think it was Cy. It was either Cy or Gordon, who I can't remember which one sent the email, and they're pitching their book. And I was thinking to myself when I read the email, I'm like, I'm not sure if this is a good fit. I'm not sure if these guys are actually superhero fans, or if they're just
they are
guys who. And then they came out and they're like, oh, okay, yeah, these guys are legit. They know what they're talking about.
Yeah, Gordon especially. He's got so many deep cuts that I'm just like, it goes over my head even.
Absolutely,
So
yeah.
listeners will also be tickled because my wife is normally the person who's much more fun to listen to as my co-host, and I think she was struggling to keep up with the conversations around comic books even more than I was. So
Yeah.
the running joke on our podcast is that we do the podcast just so that my wife has to watch more movies with me. So
it's a good way of doing that. So we've done it a little bit, but why don't you tell people a little bit more about yourself, your podcast, and that kind of stuff?
Sure. So the podcast, like I said, is In Love with Movies. The basic pitch is the comma separates the first and second halves, right? So the first half we discuss something having to do with love. If it's just my wife and I, we'll sort of pick a love topic. We can sometimes talk about past loves, or we'll talk about lessons learned from love, or we have an episode talking about the 5 love languages, which is something a lot of people are familiar with. And then the second half is always us discussing some movie. If we have a guest, that movie is picked by the guest, and then the first half is just us basically discussing their relationship, their feelings about their relationship, the experiences that they've had, and the lessons that they would impart. And none of us are experts. We're all just sort of being like, we are people who are in love, or love. I love love in all its forms, and so we share our experiences there, and then we share in the second half our love of movies. I'm a firm believer that sort of your experiences with movies, when you found them, how you watched them first, is a huge, and I seem to remember you talking about this on some of the episodes that I listened to. It's like so very defining. Like when you first watched it, we'll talk about some of the rose-colored glasses that I still had for the movie we're discussing today, Jumper, and the reasons for that we'll get into. But the second half is then always sort of like just sharing a way to get to know the person, either me getting to know my wife if she's sharing a movie, my wife getting to know me if I'm sharing a movie, or our guests, sort of what their love story is with a particular movie and why it has a meaningful impact to them. We've had some really cool conversations. Some people have some, especially when we get to have couples on, they'll have like really unique conversations about their history with a particular movie. So there might be some overlap with your listeners and fans of the YouTube channel Late to the Party. They do a bunch of like trailer reaction videos, and we were lucky enough to have Late to the Party on for an episode where they discuss their history with Interstellar, and it's a really kind of cool and interesting story that I won't spoil, so people can go listen to that over there.
Okay, very cool. Yeah, we've talked about that a lot of times on here, especially back when Derek was still around. We took in some of our earlier episodes, we talked a lot about this idea of how if you see something, comic book or movie or TV show, if you see it at the right age, like that shit's gonna stick with you for the rest of your life. Yes. And the example Derek used is he had introduced his nieces and nephews to the Harryhausen Sinbad movies back when when they were very young. And it's like, you show that to most people their age, and they would not, because they're like, I think they're about maybe in their late teens, early 20s now. You show that to those people now, they will not be charmed by them at all. But you get them at like 4 or 5 years old, they're gonna love that shit forever then.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's very true. And the movie that always comes to my mind when I talk about that is, I still haven't gotten to watch it yet, but there's a movie on my list from my childhood. I don't know if you've seen it, The Page Master. And it is this cool animated film.
Yeah, I never actually saw it, but I do remember like seeing. I remember I really wanted to see it when I was a kid, because there were like all these commercials on it on TV and stuff, and I remember being like, "Oh, that looks so cool!" And just one of those movies that I just never got around to seeing.
And if I'm being honest, if you were to watch it now, it will not have the magic for you that it had for me too. So
the one example I remember we used was The Dark Crystal, because I remember when I was in college,
Yes.
everybody talking about how amazing the Dark Crystal was, and then I watched it. I'm like, this is not that. I don't get it. But it was one of those, you had to get it at that right time. If not, then you're never gonna understand it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true of a lot of movies. And then when we look back on them, and this can start to bleed into Jumper. So, like, when we look back on them and why they were important to us, I think that describes a lot too. So, one of the reasons I decided to pick Jumper, we were talking about it before we started recording. For one thing, I was listening to some of your back catalog, and I noticed the movie Push, because it's one that's sort of, I wanted to go a little bit outside of the box, and it was easier to find one that was superhero adjacent without necessarily being, truly a Marvel or a DC type of thing. And so Push, I saw that you did that, and I was like, oh, well, I'd love to hear, Perry's thoughts on Push. And as we were saying beforehand, it reminds Push and Jumper to me are very similar. And as I was rewatching Jumper for this, I realized I think there's some of the things that in my mind and my memory had conflated the two. So you were talking about how you thought Push was sort of underrated, and we didn't get into it, but I think some of the cool things about Push that I now remember are a bit of the world building.
Yes,
and
absolutely. Yeah.
Sort of creating this space, and there's these, not just, oh, we've created these superhero type people, but like, here's a lot of backstory to go with them. I remember that being the case about Jumper. Having rewatched it, I think that's the thing that is missing the absolute most. And I have like a little bit of light Wikipedia research that I did to dig into that. But what I remember about Jumper that still does hold up was Hayden Christensen. So I am an unapologetic Star Wars fan. I wouldn't necessarily consider myself like a specifically prequels fan, but I think there's a lot that's good in those prequels, and I think Hayden Christensen, if you watch those movies, they're not a great example of his acting. I think if anybody who's a good enough fan, or a big enough fan rather, of Star Wars, they would have to admit to themselves that George Lucas is a brilliant man in many ways, but he is not an actor's director.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think that someone like Hayden, who's still so early in his career and maybe didn't have quite the level of ability as, like a Natalie Portman or a Ewan McGregor, to throw him into this huge big budget thing that's going to have a bunch of people looking at him with a microscope. And the only person there to direct him is George Lucas, who's, famously been quoted as basically only giving the direction of faster, louder. And like, that's really not useful. And it's why you end up getting this fast speaking, angsty, loud teenager, whiny Anakin. As opposed to the real person. But if you watch movies like, if you've ever seen Shattered Glass, so that's a movie
I haven't, but I have heard a lot of people talking about that.
So Shattered Glass is one that I think showcases his stuff. How about Life is a House?
No, I actually, I could have sworn I had seen him in something else, but I'm just looking over his, and I was just looking up his filmography now, because, and the only thing I've actually seen him in other than that I recognize on his list is, outside of the Star Wars stuff and now Jumper, was Virgin Suicides, but I don't remember his role in that.
I totally forgot about he was supposed to be in Virgin Suicides. It must have been real small too. It must have been even earlier on. I imagine
so, yeah.
So Life is a House is another really great one that I would recommend, because obviously this isn't superheroes. I won't talk about it too long, but I have personal attachments and dad things and stuff that go along with that. It's a story about a father and son and sort of finding their way together. It is not the best written in terms of pacing, but I think he has a lot of opportunity to act. Its shortfall is that it's still a lot of the same stuff from Star Wars, even though it would have happened before, where it's just sort of like angsty teen showing a lot of, powerful, angry, and sad emotions. Right. But he does that well. And then Philip Glass, or Shattered Glass, where he plays Philip Glass, who's this reporter, he does a really good job in that, playing kind of this understated creepy, where there's like this anxiety of his character always gonna, like, afraid that he's gonna get found out, but also like not producing, what's the word I'm looking for, projecting confidence, and the ways that he gets away with all kinds of things in that story, and it's based on a true story, like with him just having projected this confidence, but he does this subtlety where it's like he's projecting confidence, but you can kind of see it in his eyes that he's like, please don't call me on this kind of thing. And he does that so many times through the movie that I think he's just underserved. And so the other reason Hayden Christensen's on my mind is his return to, you know, Darth Vader in the Obi-Wan show, which
Yeah.
I could give you some back and forth and some goods and bads about
Mm.
that show as well. But I'm just glad to see him getting some other chance, and my hope is that that he's been positively enough received that he'll take his time and dip his toes back into acting, because I think even movies like Jumper that
Mm.
have a lot of flaws were just poorly picked projects that I think he could
Yeah.
have, like, I think actually his acting in this is pretty strong.
Mhm.
And it gives him more to do than just angsty teen, even though there is a lot of that too.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Hayden Christensen's the big reason. For those, I like to on our podcast give, like, I start always with credits. So like some just basic things. Hayden Christensen there. Sam Jackson is also in this, and Sam Jackson is kind of just doing Sam Jackson. So it's not like
Right.
it's not even a mailed-in performance, but it's also not, you know, it's not Django Unchained. He's not you know, winning Oscars for it.
Right.
But
Before
he
we
does
go
a lot of fun.
Before we go too
Continue.
deep in the movie, though, a few other things I wanted to quickly talk about before we go too deep into Jumper. First thing I wanted to ask is, what is kind of like your intro point to superhero movies, superheroes in general, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. Love that. So I am old enough that I didn't see it in person, but probably the first superhero movie that I can remember seeing is 1978 Superman.
Right.
So, you know, just the straight, you know, Marlon Brando as Jor-El, and that's probably even the earliest thing I can remember, because I don't have a specific memory of the first comic books or wanting a comic book or having a comic book, but I do know that, like, at various points cleaning out my closet in my room back at my parents' house, I can remember finding Superman comics that I remembered reading, specifically around like the Death of Superman arc and the Reign of the Supermen. I can remember having, without even having really read the stories, I had the posters. There was like this series of posters for all the different reigns of the Supermen. So if anyone's familiar with that, you've got Superboy, you've got Cyborg Superman, you've got Steel, like all these characters came out of that run of comics, and they had apparently at some point done some like centerfold types of posters.
Yeah, there was a huge media blitz around the Death of Superman and the Reign of the Superman stuff.
Oh, huge. Like this is comics in the 90s. They were just like, how can we get you to have to buy everything? And it probably came in something that had like that plastic hologram or whatever that they called it.
Yeah, like 20 different variant covers for each one. They even had the Super Nintendo video game for the Death and Return of Superman. I remember playing that as a kid.
Yeah, ooh man, the merchandising. They did it all. So yeah, Superman, that's probably me on board. And then I'm a big Spider-Man fan too. I had some early some 90s Spider-Man comics and stuff that I then was pushed away, as I think some people are, of like, oh, that's kid stuff, or that's not manly enough, or what have you. And then somewhere after, like, even after I'd gotten into grad school, and then I started reading The Walking Dead, because now all of a sudden, like, it was prestige, right? It's okay for you to be into comics because it's this prestige thing. And now I like have a series of Star Wars books and DC books and Marvel books that I just get every single week at my local comic shop. So I've re-entered that space since then.
So what are some of the books you're reading right now that are really kind of grabbing your interest then, out of curiosity?
Yeah, sure. So now that I've done some of the other stuff, the ones that really actually interest me are ones that I have discovered that are more off the beaten path. So one that's sort of a superhero topic, but for your adult listeners, it might be a more interesting exploration and departure. Not to plug another podcast, but one that I have been tearing through recently is Comic Book Couples Counseling Podcast. They do kind of something similar to us in terms of like they talk about love and relationship stuff, but they specifically relate it to some comic book characters. In addition to doing DC Marvel types of characters that we all know, they'll do more indie stuff. So there's this comic book called Sex Criminals. And
yeah. I've heard of it,
cool.
but I've never read it. It's Fraction, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So Matt Fraction, Chip Zdarsky. Yes. Okay. So you're familiar with it, at least. Anybody?
I know the name, and yeah, it's one of those things that I've heard a lot of good things about it, but other than hearing people saying like, oh, it's Matt Fraction, it's Chip Zdarsky, and it's really good, and that's all I know about it. And so it's one of those things that it's on my list, and I'm keeping an eye out for whenever it comes on sale on Comixology. Then that's probably when I'll pick it up.
That makes complete sense, and I absolutely I recommend that. It's one that I took it because they were talking about it and convinced me. I thought I liked it. I thought I'd give it a chance, and I bought like a on eBay, I think, because I like the physical copies when I'm reading comics personally. So I bought like a $3 or $4 version of the first volume or something, and then liked that enough that I immediately splurged and spent almost $100 on hardcovers of the entire series, and I'm like halfway through it now. But the pitch for that, as I'm sure you probably know, Perry, if you remember at least the name, without spoiling anything, I will just say that like within the first issue, you meet these two characters, and each of them has discovered in their youth that when they orgasm, the world freezes around them. That like at that climax, the world becomes still and it is frozen. And for a long time, they think they're the only ones. They eventually discover each other both having that superpower. And I will say, if you're hooked by that, just know that like that's only the beginning of the crazy, and where it goes from there is kind of like in the Invincible comics, where you just don't think anything new or strange could happen, and then it takes a twist and surprises you as a reader with something new.
Very cool. So in fact, Patreon listeners will, by the time this episode comes out on the main feed, Patreon listeners will actually have already heard us talking about Invincible, because the way the schedule works, that's actually going to be coming out before this episode is.
Awesome. Well, very good.
So we'll talk more about Invincible in the Patreon show. Other thing I wanted to ask you, and this is something, a new thing I've started doing on the show, is just kind of asking people what are you kind of interested in now? What's the thing that's really kind of grabbed your attention right now at the moment? It can be movies, can be TV shows, comics, video games, whatever. What are you currently like obsessing with or really into right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think maybe the thing that's big. So I watch a lot of the shows. Game of Thrones, I'm kind of watching. It's like not grabbing me as much. Same thing about Lord of the Rings. I really, really like She-Hulk. My wife and I watch that. But I think the thing that's kind of unexpectedly grabbed my attention is I've gone back to the Assassin's Creed video games. I was a big fan of those and skipped a bunch of entries for a while, as I kind of didn't love some of the more recent ones. And found them on sale, and then bought like all the ones that I had missed, and it was Odyssey, and now I'm into Valhalla of like, oh my God, this is what I remember loving about these games, and some of the storylines that are happening. So I'm pretty deep into that, and probably spend a lot of my extra free time, raiding people and assassinating ancients from the video games. So.
Yeah, I was really into. I got really into the Assassin's Creed stuff with Black Flag, and that was just that had grabbed me really hard. And then I went and I played Syndicate, and I'd gotten the first three on sale and played them a little bit here and there, and then I picked up Origin, and during Origin, like I kind of like drifted off from it, and I have Odyssey, but I haven't really dived into Odyssey yet.
So I will say this: Origin is exactly the same one that caused me to drop off.
Okay.
I thought Black Flag was probably its peak, where they had figured out, we've got the mechanics of the assassination, cool stuff, but we also have larger exploration happening. And I think that they had still an interesting story going, both sort of in the now time and the past time.
Yeah.
And so I think that was the last time that they had all of those things firing on all cylinders. Syndicate and some others were fun, but they weren't really, home runs, so to speak. Right. And then Origins, they changed so much, and it no longer felt like the same video game in terms of its gameplay, which I think is now a strength after some time. But they also, in my opinion, just totally bungled that story. I didn't care anything about the characters, either in the sort of modern day or in how they depicted them with Egypt. And so that's why I finished that one, and then was kind of like, I don't need this Greek one. I didn't love the last one, whatever. So when you've got time, pick it up, and you may become just as obsessed as me.
Yeah, because it's still on my PlayStation. Like I haven't deleted it yet, because I'm just like I'm gonna get back to it, but I just get like a bunch of other games. I'm like, I want to finish, focus on some other stuff first. But yeah, and another thing I had with Origin was just Hold on.
I was gonna say, if you need to take care of that, man.
So yeah, the Assassin's Creed game. Another problem I had with Origins was just there was so much filler with it. Like it's just this massive, huge map, and there's like all these different missions and stuff. And I'm just like, just going around, I'm like, this is just so repetitive. And finally, I'm just like, forget it, I'm done.
Yeah, and it had a lot of like, not only was the stuff repetitive, but the side missions. The main mission never seemed to grab my attention enough to make me like just choose to do that. Like I'm okay if a video game gives you that option. I'm someone who does like to go complete that stuff a lot of times, but I also like want the main mission to kind of call to me. Like almost I need to, the only reason I go do side missions is to level up enough to go do this awesome, story mission. And like I said, I just like, I don't know how you managed to get Cleopatra to not be interesting, but that's how I felt about it when it came to AC Origins. So.
Definitely. Yeah. Another thing, one of the things that I'm definitely into right now is I think She-Hulk was going to be my pick because that is just, I think I talked about this in the last episode too, the last one we recorded, that is. So by the time people listen to this, She-Hulk will have already been, over for a few months now. But man, that show was just so good. I just love that it's this. Because one of the problems I had with a lot of the other Marvel shows, both on Netflix now on Disney Plus, is that I think they're invested too much in the idea of like the season-long story arc.
Sure.
And this whole idea of we're not doing a TV series, but we're doing like a 6-hour, 8-hour, 13-hour movie, basically, is how a lot. And so there's always like this middle part that feels very kind of soft and just kind of like middling. And I don't feel that a lot with She-Hulk. Like it's got this episodic feel to it. It's almost like Ally McBeal was back in the day, but with superpowers. So it's so much fun watching it.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, I've been enjoying it so far, and I think we're only 3, maybe 4 episodes in for listeners. So if it like totally goes off the rails and people are listening to this by then and they're like, oh man, what are these dudes talking about? Like, just know that we were only talking about the first few episodes, but it's still very good so far.
Yeah, I think episode 4 is the most recent one that came out. The one with Madison, like that. I'm not sure if you saw that one yet. And the magician, the stage magician.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Yep. I do remember that specifically. Yes. And oh my God, like
2 N's and 1 Y, but it's not where you think.
Yes. Oh my God. Yeah. So that's good, and I'm glad you're going to be talking to Cy about Miss Marvel too, because I thought that was probably one of the stronger shows too. There was some middling for me. Some of the middle of that, but man, those first like 2 episodes of that were just killer. And I know Cy and I actually were texting back and forth and stuff about some of the stuff that was happening there, and me asking like, oh, is this like really kind of, because Cy is connected to that culture in a way that I obviously am not. And so just I love when something like that can, in a interesting way and not in a force feeding or preachy kind of way, cause you to want to go like learn more about a topic, especially a topic in history. And so the issues with the so many families being broken apart and people being hunted down and hurt.
The partition.
Just like, the partition. Thank you.
That interested me so much. And right after I'd finished watching the show, there was a podcast that came out called Partition that's all about like the history of that. So I haven't listened to it yet, so I don't know if it's good or not or anything, but it is on my feed, and it's something I'm really looking forward to digging into.
Yeah, I'm writing that down now. Because Cy sent me some stuff to read, because I was like, man, this is crazy that this happened. Or like I remember I had the same experience when I was watching, I don't know if you watched the TV show, since we're all about superheroes here, you probably have, but Watchmen, HBO series.
Oh yes, yeah. The Tulsa Massacre.
Yeah, I especially because of obviously what that show is, I thought to myself, oh, this must be some the horrors that they are depicting here. There's no way that this actually occurred in our real world. It must be some mistake. And sure enough, it doesn't take long for you to figure out with some Googling and some deeper digging that that's not true at all. Like that it did in fact happen, and worse.
Yeah, it was that was one of the things, because Derek had known about all that history, and he had said, when we had talked about it, he's like, this is something that I knew about, that you knew about, and I'm like, no, actually, I didn't know about it either. And but yeah, we did a 3-episode deep dive into Watchmen. So if anyone missed that, that was like, I think like around like the episode 14 or 15 or something like that. We did 3 episodes, 1 episode covering each of the 3 episodes of the TV show. So that was
awesome.
Yeah, we went really deep into that show. So definitely check that out if you're interested. But yeah, that was another example of just such an amazing way of utilizing culture and history in completely unexpected ways. And there was a lot of that in Ms. Marvel that you're right. It did make me want to track down some more of the information. I had some other issues with it, just as far as like, I think like it felt like they kind of lost focus a little bit when they were going from New Jersey to Pakistan. I felt like that was more of a season 2 thing than a season 1 thing, but that's a larger discussion. You'll hear me talk about that with Sai when he comes on. So, but now we've done kind of like the pre-roll stuff. So let's jump into Jumper.
Jumping into Jumper. I love that.
Now I remember when this movie came out, 2008. It was actually when I first came to Japan, and I remember seeing previews for it and stuff, and just kind of like thinking like, oh, it looks interesting, but it wasn't one of those things that really grabbed me enough to think I want to go see this in the theater. And so it's just one of those movies that, and then after it came out, there were a bunch of these types of movies, like these kind of like young adult / teen sci-fi superhero-ish movies. Like you mentioned Push. Also, there was another one like I Am Number 4, I think was another one of those, and Chronicle too. And there's a lot of these types of things that were happening around that time, this kind of like pre-MCU, early MCU era, where it feels like they're trying to find the next big thing, and nothing's really landing.
Yeah, I think a lot of it was probably like, at this point, X-Men and the first Spider-Man movies or so would have come out.
Yeah.
And I suspect, just knowing how studios often operate, they were probably like, nah, the kids love them superhero movies. Let's make as many superhero movies as possible. And then they went off to go find the rights for those things, and many of them were owned by like Warner Brothers or, other studios, or like, Sony owned like all the interesting Spider-Man stuff. And as you said, especially later on, like Marvel Studios was starting to become a thing. So they were holding on to their properties really tightly. So I think that, yeah, lots of people were scrounging, and that's where, I don't know if you found this, but some of your listeners may know, this is actually Jumper is based on a 1992 novel.
Yeah.
And so that, like, I'm sure they were like, well, this is, somebody had some production assistant or some, researcher who was just digging through old archives of, trying to find anything that was superhero adjacent so that they could buy the rights to it, or maybe even already had the rights. Who knows? These rights could have been purchased in like 1995, and then nobody made the movie until 2008.
Well, I mean, it was the author Stephen Gould. He didn't come out with the sequel until 2004. So there's like almost a 12-year gap between the first book and the second book. But since this movie came out, he released like 2 other books after that.
I saw that. I was like, it was funny. This movie obviously didn't generate enough to warrant the money for a sequel in terms of the movies. But yeah, like he wrote a book that was all about the other character in this, and I'm forgetting the character's name now. Oh goodness, played by Jamie Bell, the guy who was in Billy Elliot.
Griffin.
Thank you, Griffin. It's literally like Jumper Griffin's story or something like that. And as I was looking things up about the novel, the character of Griffin doesn't even exist in the novel.
Oh,
so
really?
Like right? I'm just like, what? So apparently, yeah, like this was popular enough, and that character was popular enough that he was like, I'm gonna write a story now about Griffin and sort of like make it be something that exists in the same world as these other novels that didn't have him before. And yeah,
that was also the basis. There was a video game tie-in, and it was Griffin's story, like the hunt for his parents' killer, was also like the basis for that video game.
Oh, that's awesome! I didn't know about that, or forgot about it, because that actually sounds familiar. But I did not find that in my digging. No.
Yeah, it's weird how everyone's getting interested in Griffin, because I don't know. I'm not sure about you, but I had never. Griffin didn't, like, none of the characters really grabbed me that much, so it feels weird to me that they're going to be like, we think Griffin's so awesome, we're going to do a video game and a tie-in novel about him.
Well, I'm sure it was at the time, a lot of that stuff was greenlit before they knew how. There's like merchandising.
Yeah. And there's also a TV spinoff apparently too called Impulse. It was on
YouTube.
YouTube.
I saw that
YouTube
too,
Premium,
and it was only on YouTube's Premium, and I was like, oh man, the only thing that anyone knows YouTube Premium for is Cobra Kai.
Yeah.
And it's only because like I feel like most of the world didn't even know it existed until Netflix picked it up. So
yeah.
although I was that guy who was doing the like occasional, I would buy for 1 month the YouTube Premium subscription to watch the first 2 seasons of Cobra Kai. So
well, apparently it had gotten this series Impulse had gotten 20 episodes. It had 2 seasons, 10 episodes each, and fairly recently, like it came out in 2018.
Yeah, I saw that.
So I didn't even realize YouTube was still doing original programming.
Right? Yeah, I thought the same thing when I read it. There were so many interesting things. Like this movie, I could go on and on too about some of the stuff that happens, good and bad.
Yeah.
But like, I almost think the story behind other pieces to it is fascinating to me. Like, you know, you mentioned there's this spin-off TV series. There was a spin-off video game I didn't even know about. You know, the fact that you've got people behind this that, you know, it just is so fascinating because like apparently the other thing is I read the whole plot of the idea of there being these paladins, right? That was not in the book at all either.
Oh, okay.
Like essentially the character that Samuel Jackson plays was just an NSA agent. So like that's supposed to be a nod in the first scene where he like fake introduces himself as an NSA agent.
I see.
But for whatever reason, I guess they decided like maybe because it was still too close to 9/11 that they didn't want to like make NSA people look bad, or they just felt that people were more into secret societies at the time, because I feel like secret, you know, cloak and dagger types of organizations was a thing. But to me, that like hurts this story too, because one of the weakest points is they like create this whole idea of the paladins, and we kind of talked earlier about like this movie does not do a good job with world building.
Yeah. That was my biggest thing, because Push really impressed me because it was this movie that wasn't really well received at the time, and I watched it. I'm like, okay, yeah, I can see why people didn't respond to this movie. It's got a lot of soft areas. It definitely kind of, it loses my interest about halfway into it. But the world building is so well done, and I'm just like, I want to see like a TV show set in this world with these concepts. All of that was done so well, and using a different setting, like what was it, Hong Kong, I think. That was also really cool. Being an expat myself, I think that's a really interesting thing to do that to move it to a different area instead of always like New York or nondescript U.S. city that's actually Vancouver or something like that. So I thought it was really cool to say like, no, we're gonna put this in Hong Kong, and again, they didn't do much with that concept, but just the idea of it was something different that a lot of other things weren't doing.
Yes.
And this one, I think it's cool that I love that they shot in so many different locations. They really took advantage of the teleporting aspect of that, and moving around, because I'd read they'd actually filmed on location like 20 different cities or something like that.
Oh, and it looks gorgeous. They did a great job with like however they make the teleporting look, and then the cinematography of like we are filming an actual city, and you can sense that. Yeah,
all of that was really, really good. But the biggest problem with Push was it had a great world building, but it had not so great characters and not so great story. This one, it didn't have great world building, and the characters weren't that great either, and the story was just like, I don't even know what the story is. If you put a gun to my head and you demanded I tell you what this story is, I just be like, pull the trigger. I can't do it.
Yeah, I feel very similarly. Like I had said earlier, I think I conflated some of my memories of time as Jumper, and then also my rose-colored glasses that I will die on the hill that Hayden Christensen did a pretty decent job at his acting in this. But he also didn't have a lot to go on. Like that character is not fleshed out.
It's the same problem with the prequel trilogy, right? He's a good actor. You can see there's talent there, but it's just like he's just given such bad material to work with, and I'm just like,
yes.
because I had rewatched the prequels. I think it was like last year. My wife was interested in going through and seeing all the Star Wars stuff. Now it's all on Disney Plus and it has Japanese subtitles. So she was interested in going back and going through and watching all the movies. So we went and we did that, and watching the prequels and getting to the Anakin stuff, I was just like, I'm like, God, he's so fucking annoying. And I'm like, but it's not his fault, because it's just like, that's the way the character is written. The character is written to be an irritating little shit. And I'm like, and he's good in that, but it's just like, I wish you had better material to work with.
Yes, so much so. And I actually think this is one where there's still not a lot done, but he shows ranges. Like there's scenes where he's, opposite Diane Lane, or there's the scene where like he flips back to his dad's house and clearly is like stashing stuff there. And there's that moment where he's been gone for 8 years. His dad has not actually seen him in person, but like has kept hearing him, and you can just tell like, and Michael Roker, who like was not really a name by this time either, also doing a phenomenal job. He's running up there and he's like, desperately saying like, I basically, I think you are there. I know you can hear me. Like, just tell me if you're alive, or tell me I'm not crazy, or something like that.
Yeah.
And then Hayden has this moment where, he stops and he's thinking, and it's just kind of like you're looking at his face and you see this like confliction within him, because there's these mixed emotions of like, I do not have a good relationship with this man. There's a reason that I left in the first place. But like, I don't want him to think he's crazy. Like, he doesn't deserve that kind of thing. And like, all of that's there. And then the funny thing to me is like, there's more in both of those actors' faces that's being presented than is ever explained or shown in any way for like a backstory. They're just kind of like, I think there's a line somewhere in there before he's even, Hayden Christensen, he says something like, well, my home life wasn't much of a home, or my dad wasn't much of a dad. And like, that's all you have to go on. You don't really see him ever be particularly mean or anything. He doesn't seem to understand it, but like, there's no depth to that. There's no character development. You have no idea like if he abused him or whatever. And even the idea that they maybe set it up as like, oh, and that's why the mother left. But they pull the rug out from underneath that idea when they make a choice.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's so many
end up being one of these paladins that clearly only left for that reason. It's like, what the heck?
There is such a dearth of talent in this movie, both behind and on camera. I mean, it's you've got Christensen, as we've been talking about, Max Thoreau, playing David at 15. Rachel Bilson's in this. Samuel L. Jackson, Jamie Bell, Diane Lane, Teddy Dunn from Veronica Mars, Michael Rooker, even Kristen Stewart, and like at the end there. But it's just like, there's so many good actors in this, and it's just like such a good director. Like Doug Liman is such an underrated director. I mean, I will die on this hill, but Born Identity, Edge of Tomorrow, where I prefer the re-release title of it.
Live, Die, Repeat.
Live, Die, Repeat. Yeah, I thought that was a much better title of it. But yeah, these and Doug Liman. I mean, the original the first Born Identity movie. Like, I will die on this hill, but that movie is the best one of that trilogy. The other two, I fucking despise Paul Greengrass and his I've never heard of a tripod style of directing. It's just like it annoys. Like I want, when I see an action movie, I want to actually be able to see the action. And and in Born Identity, it was brilliant. Like the way he shot it, the way he filmed the action, all of it was perfect. Then we get, and this is another tangent, but Paul Greengrass just like, he's like, I'm gonna have the camera, moving all around the place, so you have no idea what the hell's going on. But yeah, and then I always thought it was such a travesty that Lyman got those movies taken away from him, and he hasn't really been able to have this breakout really since. But he has this, and you can see, like, even though he's got a terrible script, like the movie, like you were saying, the movie looks beautiful. He does a great job utilizing all these locations and filming them in a way that looks amazing. But also, like,
even the script, talking about the people behind this, because like all through it, there's people that are like, you see what other movies these people have done, and they're like stellar work. Like the names I wrote down, David S. Goyer is like someone who pinned for Dark Knight trilogy,
the Blade films.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. But also Simon Kinberg did a draft of the script as well, or did some work on it. And he did the And you know, it's funny because both of them, they've got both of those writers, they've got amazingly good stuff like Goyer and the Dark Knight trilogy, or the first two Blade movies, or then you've got Kinberg and Days of Future Past or X2. But then you've also got Goyer with The Crow, City of Angels, and Blade Trinity, and Batman v Superman, and Jumper now too. And then, you know, Simon Kinberg, which he did Days of Future Past, but then he did Apocalypse and Dark Phoenix, and both of them, they both tried their hands at directing, and it was awful both times too. So you got a real mix there with those two. But I mean, Doug Liman, when I think about it, I think this is the first time I've seen a bad movie of his.
Yeah, my wife and I, on our podcast, one of the things we always do with our guests is we like ask for a rating at the end, but then we also say, would you renew your vows? Like, regardless of what you rate it, for you personally, would you watch this again, kind of thing. And I turned to my wife after we watched this past week, and I said, I don't think I ever need to see this again. So spoiler, yeah. I'm not renewing my vows to this movie. Like, my memory of it was way better than.
Yeah, it's just I'm not even. Like I said, I found myself drifting off. It's only, and the weird thing is, it's under 90 minutes. It's not a very long movie,
right?
But it is one of those movies where it feels so much longer than it really is.
Yes, yeah. Which is sad, but it's because of all this talent behind it. But yeah, you go watch this movie and you're like, oh, now I understand why it was forgotten to the annals of moviedom.
Yeah, which makes me wonder why they. Because, like, I was so surprised when you said that they didn't have the Griffin character in the novel at all. So I'm just kind of like, there was
like, what was the story?
Yeah,
right?
because
they didn't have the Griffin character. They didn't have the Paladins. It was like,
right.
I think they basically took the idea of a teenager who, you know, has this power, and that's it. If I remember correctly, oh God, I wrote something down here. Oh, maybe it was just, basically from what I remember, because I was reading the Wikipedia page, it says, like, the first setup, like the first part where it's not even Hayden Christensen, which, by the way, it takes like 15 minutes before the main actor is on the screen for longer than 3 seconds.
Yeah.
Like, there's this moment where it's like zooming in on Hayden and he's like clearly doing a voiceover to set up then what is 15 minutes of some completely different actor, which is funny in itself. But apparently, like, that setup, the idea of like, this is his backstory, that was the same. And then nothing else. Like, no, paladins, no, none of the same actors, characters, etc. And so it's just like, wow, what is this? Is, and that's another thing, is I feel like Hollywood often just is like, when we're scrambling for, you know, superhero movies are popular right now, we got to come out with more superhero movies. They take some kernel of an idea and then they just like do whatever they want to it. I just feel like I feel studio notes all over this thing.
Definitely. Yeah.
All over this thing.
Yeah. I mean, well, like, another thing I'm trying to figure out is I can't understand why Samuel L. Jackson even dyed his hair, because there's one scene where it's like the hair dye starts getting smeared on his face. And I'm like, didn't somebody notice this when they were filming it?
Oh, man. Yeah, that's another valid question. Why? Like, what was that choice? Maybe, I don't know, was Dennis Rodman a thing in 2008, or is that later
No,
on?
I mean, that's what I'm trying to figure out. Like, I don't get why he's doing this. And I'm not sure if that's a decision by the studio, if that's something that Jackson did himself. Like, he just shows up on set one day and he's like, I decided to dye my hair white. I mean, that's very probable. So,
I'm mother effing Samuel Jackson. You're not going to tell me not to.
Well, I mean, I think, yeah, because I'm looking up the story of the original book now. Apparently his mother was murdered on a business trip by terrorists because her plane was hijacked.
Oh my God, I didn't get that part.
Yeah, I didn't get that. And he went out basically for revenge, trying to find the terrorist who was responsible.
Okay.
And it's like, that's a
more interesting story.
It's so much more interesting, especially when you got the NSA aspect of it as well. It seems like such a much more interesting story than what we got. And it feels like I don't know who felt like we needed to have, because I remember you made the point about maybe it was too close to 9/11, but I mean, this is 2008. It's,
we've definitely had things with terrorists.
So it's not that close to it. So I don't think that's. I don't know why they felt that they had to have this whole idea of this secret society, which is, and again, I don't understand what the purpose of this society is. Or another thing too is when Jackson, Roland, when he meets David for the first time, the way he talks about jumpers, it almost feels like they're not, jumpers aren't the only type of superpowered characters in this universe.
Yeah.
Kind of like in Push. Like, and I think that's where a lot of the conflation in your mind came through with Push, because Push had these different categories of powers, and so you had like you had the pushers, you had the, I can't remember all of them, but you go back and re-listen to the episode.
Spheres or something like that.
Yeah. And the way Roland talks about pushers in this, like he says, oh, he's a pusher, or he's a jump. See, I'm already conflating them. he's like, oh, he's a jumper and all this. I'm like, wait, so does that mean there are other types? But then they're never mentioned at all.
Yeah.
There's like this whole world building aspect to it that is just completely ignored. Because I'm just like, because at first I'm intrigued by the idea of like, okay, he's working for this organization. They're trying to go after these guys, but why? I don't it just never makes any sense to me, because he says like this power is only reserved for God, and I'm just like, this doesn't even begin to make sense.
Yeah, there's like this weird sort of pseudo-religious aspect to things, but they don't really connect any of that to these. I wonder, this is around the same time as like League of Extraordinary Gentlemen and stuff like that too, which go look that movie up, everyone. And that like is the last movie that sadly Sir Sean Connery ever did. But and so like, speaking of studio notes, it makes me wonder if there was like a note that was like, well, what if his mother was still alive, and could you maybe make this open for sequels? Like, it feels like someone took the plot initially and said, well, not only are superheroes cool right now, secret societies are cool right now, we want this to be a franchise because that's the only thing we want to do right now is create franchises. And by the way, we have Diane Lane in some deal where she has to do more movies with us, so why don't you make her be in this so that when the sequels happen, she has to sign longer? And I feel like it almost feels to me like there was this solid thing probably built on that terrorist plot you're talking about, or some aspect of the original novel, and then someone said, no, we need to make this so that there's a secret society and that it can be having sequels. And then they went back and they were like, okay, we're going to like create these paladins and we're going to do this subplot, like mother secretly still being alive. That's always interesting. It's not redundant or overdone. And it feels like those rewrites were done like in a weekend. And that's why the world building is just like not there. Because it was just like, we don't have time to think about any depth of this. We have to, we're starting filming on Monday. Friday, they told us to make it a franchise. So now we have to figure it out.
Well, especially that scene at the end when we find out that his mother is still alive and he goes to see her. And she says, well, I was a paladin and I couldn't, and my choices were either to kill you or to leave you. But then she says, but the thing that killed, and I'm like, okay, that's, cliche, but understandable story point. But then I think at the end when he's like, so what are we going to do now? And she says, well, I'm going to give you a head start. I'm like, wait a minute. So you left your son because you didn't want him to die. And now you're saying that you're going to come hunt him down? Like, I couldn't.
Yeah. You left your son at 5 years old because you didn't want to have to kill him. You heard about him being arrested and therefore showed up to help break him out of Italy randomly. And then when he shows up on your doorstep, all of a sudden the change tune is, I'm coming for you, here's your 5 seconds type of thing. Like, yeah, so inconsistent.
It's so inconsistent. And it's just like, and not enough is explained about how these jumpers exist, why they exist. Because with the mother disappearing, I had gotten this, I thought they were building up to the whole thing of like, she was a jumper too, that's why he's a jumper or something like that. But there's no, not even that small bit of explanation. None of that is there. So I just find myself thinking, I'm like, I mean, at least in Push, there was an attempt to explain things to some extent. they're just like, no, we don't want to explain anything.
Yeah, I
just
feel
go
like
with
they
it.
were just like, oh, dude, we have Darth Vader, because I'm sure they wouldn't have like really been thinking of his name. They'd be like, that kid from the Star Wars movies is in this. We got Diane Lane and Sam Jackson. This is definitely going to sequel. We don't have to bother to explain the backstory because we're gonna have more movies to do that. It feels like
Right.
that was the sentiment. Like,
Oh,
we're
yeah.
gonna get sequels, so we don't have to worry about trying to do any world building. We'll do it in the next one.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then surprise, when you don't do a good job world building, you don't get a next one.
Right, exactly. It's very much like, it reminds me of a lot like Batman v Superman, and like where they're focused so much on, we have to build up for all the sequels. I'm like, well, you kind of forgot that you still have a story you have to tell in this movie.
Yes. And that's where you end up with things that are like, and I actually think that had they done more with the mother plot and the whole Martha thing in different ways, that could have been interesting. But instead, like the moment when he first says, like, why did you say that name? I literally remember thinking to myself, like, I had to remind myself that Bruce Wayne's parents, his mother's name was Martha, because out of nowhere, he's just like, why did you say that name? And I'm like, why do you care that he said that name? You've done nothing to set this up for me.
I remember seeing that in the theater, and I'm just like, it was a surreal moment, because I'm just like, this is not happening right now. This is not happening right now.
Yeah, even because they like let it happen, and he keeps going, "You don't say my name, don't say my name." And then I was like, "Oh yeah, both of their parents' names are Martha." Okay, is that really the thing that we're hanging this entire turn on?
Yeah.
Anyway,
Anyway,
movies that have flaws.
yeah. I mean, this isn't that bad. I will say that it's not as bad as it's not as offensively bad as Batman v Superman, but it is just bland, right? It's just like there's nothing there, and it plods along. It's very, for a Doug Liman movie with so much action and so many different locations, it should move a lot faster than this.
Yeah, it should be like the Bourne Identity. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it just unfortunately doesn't. And it's like, and that's the thing, is like, I actually do think there's kernels of ideas there. Like, even despite them having done a shitty job of making me care, an inconsistency with characters, I still leave the movie being like, well, I want to know more about this history of the Paladins. When did they start? They're kind of implying that it maybe started way back in,
medieval times or something.
Medieval times. Yeah. And it's like, have they been therefore tracking these jumpers since way back then? And what is all of that?
Well,
but they kind of like, go ahead.
They set up so many different avenues for what the main story can be here.
Yes.
Like, you've got the idea of, there's even this one aspect in the beginning when he's in his swanky New York apartment, and he sees on the TV that there are these people who are trapped and they don't have any help. And then he gets up and he walks and he takes the umbrella, and the doorman says like, oh, it's not going to rain. He's like, oh, well, you never know. And it seems like they're setting it up to him going out there to help people. And then he just goes to London to sleep with some random chick. And I'm just like, why set that up so much? And then just do this complete 180 twist. And like, there's so many different, and the whole idea is it sets up this idea in that one scene of like, and I figured out, I'm like, oh, okay, I see what we're doing here. He's selfish. He's only using his powers for personal gain. He's going to go on a heroic journey. He's going to realize he has to use his powers to help. He doesn't. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. But then there's the whole idea of like, he leaves his father. It's like his mother left him. So I was like, okay, so the story, he has this power. He can go anywhere in the world. So he's going to try and track down his mother and find out why she left. And that's just like a postscript at the end of the movie. And but even like, he reconnects with his school time crush. So he's going to use his powers to impress her but he just takes her on a plane to Italy. And then it's like, it's gone. Or then you got the Paladin stuff. It's like, oh, there's the secret society. And Roland even mentioned somebody's helping you with this. And it's like, no.
Yeah, he's like, oh, there must be somebody else. And that reminds me of, there's a line when Griffin says like, welcome to the war, or things like that. And so there's like this implication that there's this army of jumpers out there. But then 10 minutes later, Griffin is saying like, nah, man, this is my fight. I'm fighting it alone. And fuck you, you can't do anything with this. And it's like, well, then what war were you talking about? Like, why did you make it seem like you wanted to recruit him? Like, why are you following him? What is going on?
It feels like they had 10 different scripts and they just took elements from different ones and put them and cobbled them all together.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And it's so frustrating.
Yeah.
It's like, because like you said, any one of these things. I remember I was thinking the same thing when I was like, oh, I forgot about this whole. Maybe he goes and saves people and does
Mm.
nice things when it shows at the very beginning. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, it's so weird because that is like the perfect. I'm not sure if you know about Save the Cat, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
And
that is the perfect Save the Cat moment right there, right? He's this selfish guy. He's stealing all this money. He's spending it all on himself. And then, but he goes to this, this hurricane ravaged area to help people out. And that right there, Save the Cat moment, right there. And you just walk past it.
Yeah. And then they could even have set that up, like you said, of like an interesting hero's journey where he like comes to realize that he should be using his powers for good. And they even, I think, do like the girlfriend or whatever could have served for that purpose to help drive that narrative, but they just don't do that either.
Yeah.
Like instead she's just like worried that he's breaking into places. She's never being like, she never finds out about his powers and then is like, you should use this for good. And then that becomes the thing that convinces him. No, she just like finds out about his powers. And by that time they're blowing up her apartment. Like,
I mean, yeah, that's the thing. Like, there's also this whole setup where you could do it as like, a love story type thing where he's using his powers to impress her, like, with the thing, like taking her, but that's just dropped very quickly to focus on the paladins chasing him thing.
And then with the paladins thing and like talking about, because there's this line that Griffin says something about like, he tried to move a whole building with his jump. There's some other guy that tried to move a whole building with his jump and he's dead.
Yeah.
Right? So like, there's another like side plot of like, are there more jumpers? Does Griffin know the other jumpers or is it just him? And then B, they have that big moment where Hayden, then it's like kind of, that's the only line, but then there's like kind of this implied big moment because Hayden manages to move the entire room, like a huge section of a building. And so there could have also been this cool plot of like, Hayden is the most powerful jumper that ever existed and he's going to explore that. But again, no, never actually go anywhere into that. It's just like a line in a moment and vaguely connected.
Yeah, I don't understand why someone didn't think like maybe we should connect some of these story threads together, because there's so many different ways you can use. Any one of these could be the focus of a whole movie and could be pretty good, damn good movie. But like, I'm just kills me out because I'm hung up on that hero thing because I'm just like okay. So I remember watching it and I'm like, okay, so he's going to do the hero thing and then he's going to come back and he's going to go back to be the self. So he's got that aspect of goodness. Then he goes away, goes off to London, and then he comes back. He's like, oh, I guess you're right. I didn't need the umbrella. I'm like, oh, so you're just an asshole then. I guess this is what what you're telling us.
Right?
Here.
Like, truly. Like you're just a douche and there's absolutely no reason we should care about you as a character. And that reminds me, because a lot of times my wife and I, because of the nature of our podcast, when we're watching movies, something we just end up discussing a lot of times is how romantic relationships are depicted in movies. This romantic relationship should throw red flags for any woman. Like they do not set up that they're actually dating in high school. It sort of seems like he just maybe has a fling for her and you can't tell if she's just being nice or is actually into him. And then he disappears for 8 years, shows up again and says, hey, want to go to Italy? Red flags everywhere. You should not be getting
especially when he's being so vague about what he does for a living. I mean, so he's 15, so that's 8 years later. So he's what, like 23, 20, something like that now. So you got this guy who's like clearly didn't finish high school and has disappeared for 8 years. Now he comes back, he's flashing all this money around. He's like, oh, I'm in banking.
Yeah.
That's a believable story. Come on.
Yes. And there's no reason she should like even leave with him, let alone fall in love with him.
Well, I mean,
like,
she even that's the thing that kills me is like she knows it too because she points it out. She's like, you were terrible at math. You failed algebra. How the fuck are you in banking at 23 years old? And it's just like I wouldn't lie to you. And it's like, oh, okay.
Right? You had a traumatic experience where you gave me a snow globe, so clearly you're a trustworthy person.
Yeah.
Oh man. Oh yeah. It's just so bad. That comes up a lot too, especially I feel like in the mid 2000s. Just every relationship that exists is because, again, like I feel like studio notes. There's so many movies that it's like you could just feel like they were like, people want there to be a boy girl, boy meets girl. There's always got to be a boy meets girl, or there can't be. And so you have movies that like don't need it, don't deserve it, don't have it there, and it's just like a boy meets a girl anyway. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
and
yeah.
they fall in love for absolutely nothing that is justified by what is depicted on the screen.
No.
Like they fall in love because they fall in love.
Yeah. There's no evidence of any sort of real romantic connection between them, because like, and again, Christensen is a good actor. Bilson, maybe not as good, but she's decent enough.
She's okay. She's okay.
I mean, but like if you see her in things like, she was good in The Last Kiss. She was really funny in her appearances on How I Met Your Mother. So she's got some talent. Like she's not a worthless actress, is what I'm saying.
Correct.
She's got enough to play believable characers. But it's just like
they gave her anything.
If they gave her anything to work with, but like her and Christensen, they just have no. It's very similar to, him and Natalie Portman in the Star Wars movie. It's like, Anakin and Padme, they've got both great actors, but just like no chemistry, nothing. There's nothing there. I felt the same thing with him and Rachel Bilson, because it's like both of these guys can clearly act, but it's like there's not enough that's making me buy their relationship at all.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's not like
we're bad at tangents, but like side tangent too. I think Natalie Portman hasn't had chemistry with anyone since Leon the Professional. That's a hot take. You can listen to our episode about the most recent Thor movie. I think she's a brilliant actress, but like, she is not good. And Hayden, again, Hayden and Bilson in this is just like, there was nothing on the page for them. It's like, I showed up back in your life, so we're in love still, right?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah. But even the whole idea with the schoolyard bully coming back too, and I'm just like, this feels like this is 5 years too late for this moment to happen. Right?
Yes.
It feels really weird. But again, that's another story point. Like, him going back and resolving old grudges, and people would be like, why are you being such an asshole now? It's like, but there's so many different things. But yeah, the whole point about her character only exists in this movie so that Roland has something to hold over David's head. That's it. That's the only reason. It's right out of Spider-Man 3, where it's, the only reason Mary Jane shows up at the end there is so the villains can kidnap her.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's sad, frankly. I mean, that's a reason that we have people who have levied very legitimate complaints against the movies that have existed in the movie industry, and the fact that there's men that, I mean, like, I'm sure you've heard the stories of like the previous Disney exec that was saying over at Marvel, no, we can't do a Black Widow movie because we don't see female-led superheroes.
Ron Perlman, yeah.
And it's just like, what? Like, and that's the attitude towards women, or the attitude is, the woman can be in the movie, but she has to be effectively, like you're saying, like she's a pretty object that he cares about.
Exactly.
And that's the purpose that she serves.
Yeah.
What is it? Is it Bechdel or Bechdel test?
The Bechdel test. I think it's Bechdel test. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Bechdel test. So like, it sounds like you're familiar with it. It's basically the idea of like, do you have women on screen discussing anything other than the men of the movie? And like, nope. Doesn't, not only does she not have like that discussing other men, she doesn't have a scene with another woman. Like,
no. The only other women in this movie are the woman he sleeps with at the bar, his mother, and his estranged sister. And that's it.
Yeah.
That's it. That's it.
Yeah, Kristen Stewart, that like apparently his half sister or something that he like throwing in there at the end. And that was funny because this was before this would have been before those movies, the Twilight movies.
Oh, really?
But I feel like when they open the door for her, there's almost this framing of like, hey, look, it's the chick from Twilight, and like that wouldn't have been a thing when this movie first came out.
Oh, okay, so yeah, that came out the same year apparently as this.
Yes, it would have been right at the same time. I think. I wonder then if maybe that, coming to think of it, maybe there was enough distance in between them that they were like, because if this came out after, but like only a couple of months, maybe that made a huge difference.
I wonder if maybe like, again, because it seems like they were so like you talked about before, they're so focused on setting things up for a sequel or like a franchise here. So I wonder if they're like, well, she's in this vampire movie. We know it's really popular book, so it's going to be a really popular movie series. So let's get her in now for the sequel, because then the sequel can be like his mom, and her mom hunting him down, which doesn't make any sense, but that you could see that's
Could
the
be a
path
thing.
they're going down. Yeah.
That would have been, and again, would have been more interesting than what you get from this movie.
Yeah.
No women. And then I think there's like, he has a conversation with like a friend of hers when he's looking for her at a bar or something like that. But it's like literally, other than Bilson's character, even Diane Lane, who's a brilliant actress in her own right as well, like has 2.5 scenes. You know what I mean? Like, and all of them again direct interactions with him.
Why do they keep wasting Diane Lane in superhero movies? Is what I want to know.
Yes. We'll stay away from the Superman once again. It's too bad. But
I don't know. I think that's all I have to say about Jumper. Is there anything else you wanted to mention?
So we talked about Millie being unbelievably trusting. I will say, like, I think, and this is again, I think almost a criticism of the like studio execs we've been talking about. I will say, like, part of the reason I'm sure I loved this is it is like teenage boy fulfillment fantasy.
Oh yeah.
Like, and that is it. Like, it is just, you don't need to know anything further than I can go anywhere in the world that I want to, literally in an instant, and I have all the money in the world that I could possibly want, and I can sleep with any woman that I possibly want. And like, that is just like, that was as far as anyone actually got to in terms of this movie.
I think, and it's so telling. That is
time, you know
that is the best part of the movie, actually. When he's doing his Jumper thing and he's going to all these different places, right? He's surfing in one part of the world. He's having lunch on the Sphinx, another part.
Yes.
And he's like, then I remember, and even now I can see that, you know, me being a guy on the verge of 40, like watching it now, I could be like, I can think back. I'm like, oh yeah, that would have been really cool to have that power when I was that age. And it's like this whole idea of like, because one of the big things, like when you're young, you're adventurous, you want to travel, but you don't have the fucking money to do it. So it's like, that's such a cool idea. It's like, okay, he can go anywhere in the world. He doesn't have to worry about the money because he can just, boom, he's there. And I'm like, there's so many different stories you could tell with just that concept. And again, they just waste it. It's just wasted.
Yeah, because oh, absolutely. Just like you said, it's like, that's just like so much wish fulfillment, and like I think you summarize it perfectly as to why. So I won't even restate that. But other things that like are just random inconsistent. They clearly like meant for Samuel L. Jackson's knife that he keeps killing the jumpers with.
Yeah.
Like he's like ceremonially peeling it out of this piece of leather and then stabbing them. And it's like zero explanation. There's never a name for it. There's no explanation as to why it matters, or if like jumpers can only be killed by this knife, like it has to be silver for werewolves or something. And then one last thing I will just give is like a criticism. Is like, there's this inconsistency about whether or not it's okay to like jump in public. Like at one point they're like, oh, you know, be discreet about this behavior. You know, you being indiscreet is what causes the paladins to find us. And then in the next scene, they're like both just jumping in broad daylight in and out of crowds, or like jumping a car for a cool chase scene. And it's just like, okay, either this is a thing that we need to keep secret, or it's a thing that we flash in front of people for fun. It can't be both.
But that's another thing too, and that goes back to the whole idea of like this whole war aspect, this whole like underground people, because there's never the way Griffin's talking about it, like showing in the ropes, like this is something. It's almost like he's like, why didn't somebody teach you this? Didn't the head of the Jumper League or whatever come and explain the rules to you? And it's like, and he's like, the way he's talking, it seems like there should have been someone who sought him out. So it's like there's this whole aspect of it. It's like, why don't you know this? It's like, well, is there a group? Was there a manual? Like, how is he supposed to know? I just don't understand what's going on here.
And actually, now that I'm like clicking, I'll bet you, we were talking about Assassin's Creed earlier, thinking about the timelines of things. I think the first Assassin's Creed game came out around 2008. So I believe so.
Yeah, like
2007.
Yeah, 2007, somewhere like that. Yeah.
Yeah, because or maybe it was even 2006. I would have gone to college in like 2006, and I remember probably my sophomore years when I was playing that first Assassin's Creed game, and I was one of the people who was obsessed with it at the very beginning. But that always has this storyline of like these two competing forces, the assassins versus the Templars, and they're both these secret societies, and you're supposed to quote unquote be rooting for one over the other. that again, like it seems like they're setting that up, as you said, like he should have been trained by an assassin and somebody should have taken them under their wing, and why didn't that occur? Because otherwise you are going to get caught by these Templars. You should know that these Templars exist. You should
Which
know
is
that
another story that could have been here, right? The whole Buffy type of thing where
yes,
she wasn't, they got her late in life. She wasn't flagged as a potential early on, so she doesn't have the same, like something like that. Like that's another thing you could have done here. And it's just like it's every there's so many different stories that they had so many different story ideas and they just didn't pick one.
Yeah. I think that's the best summary of this movie. So much squandered potential, too many story ideas, and not enough choosing.
So actually, the first Assassin's Creed game that did come out in 2007. I just looked that up.
Awesome. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, they probably were, again, with those like last minute scramblings of, oh, we gotta, create I'm sure they probably were like, hey, this game's really popular now.
I'm pretty sure that's exactly where the Paladin idea came from, because the whole time I'm watching, like when he's freaking out about God and everything like that, I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, okay, white hair, part of some ancient order of assassins or whatever they are. They call themselves Paladins. I'm like, they're the Knights Templar, basically, is what they're trying to say.
Yeah.
Or like the pop culture version of the Knights Templar. And so, and now that you made that connection to that, like that totally clicks. That totally tracks. Like they're like, well, Templars are the villains in Assassin's Creed. Let's just make them the villains in this movie, and we'll call them the Paladins instead.
Yeah, and then someone was like, oh, but do we think they might come after us since we're so close to those video games if we actually just call them Templars? Yeah, they might. Well, let's go ahead and use a Google machine for synonyms of the Knights Templar.
What's a synonym for Templar? Oh, Paladin. Boom. There we go.
Boom. There we go. Yeah.
Oh God. It's just, it's got such a feel of being written by committee. Yes. And it's like by a committee of people who were who were just, I can just imagine that it's a bunch of people sitting around in a hotel room. And they're like, look, we got to finish this up so that we can snort some cocaine. And it's that's exactly what I feel like is happening here. Because it's just like everything is just so slapped together and rushed in this script.
Yeah. We got to get it out, man. We've got all these great people signed on for it, so we just have to have something.
Yeah. It's just
don't worry, they've already greenlit the sequels. All we need is to we'll figure out the rest later. We'll back into this thing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this has been a fun conversation, Perry. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for coming on. I was worried about this because I'm watching because I remember you saying in the emails that you'd had this, this soft spot for this film, and I'm like, after I watched it last time, I'm like, oh God, this is gonna be an interesting conversation. Then
I'm gonna come in and want to tear this movie apart.
I'm gonna just totally destroy his favorite movie. Yeah, it's not gonna be good.
No, thankfully that's not the case. I'm glad I revisited it though, because again, like I have these fond memories, and now I can just permanently register it in my brain as like, yes, a good example of how Hayden Christensen has not been given a good enough chance. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing else really truly redeemable.
And now hopefully you can separate it from Push a little bit more in your memory.
Yeah, I might have to go rewatch Push now to be able to, but I'll give it a couple of years. That way I don't conflate them again 10 years from now.
Okay. All right, Nick, why don't you tell people where they can find you and your show and all that stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. So once again, if you enjoyed hearing me talk about movies, my wife is way funnier and way more entertaining to listen to even than I am. So come find us on any podcast platform or YouTube. And that's just at In Love with Movies. That's in love, with movies. You can also find us on social platforms, Instagram, Twitter, @ the letter N, Love with Movies. So at In Love with Movies, but just the letter N instead of the word. And then, if you want to find me and talk about movies or suggest movies that you think I should see based on what you've learned about me here, my socials are at Nic Loves Movies. That's NIC Nick, LUV Love, Nic Loves Movies. So find me there on those things. And if you do want to hear Perry maybe see if he can convince his significant other to come talk about movies with him too, go ahead and @ him and then @ In Love with Movies and be like, Perry, we want to see you on @ In Love with Movies. And then maybe we'll be able to figure that out too.
We'll talk about that off mic. But yeah, thanks so much for coming on, and we'll have links to all that stuff in the show notes. So if anyone didn't catch it, just go to the show notes. All that stuff will be there. But that does it for this episode of Superhero Cinephiles. SuperheroCinephiles.com is the website. Super Cinema Pod on Twitter and Instagram. And remember, you sign up for the Patreon, you get each of these episodes a week in advance. Plus, you get access to the companion podcast, the book club, where we talk about comic books and all that fun stuff. And if you're a Patreon subscriber, Nic, by the time you hear this, we haven't recorded it yet, but by the time you do hear this, Nic will have already been on. So you can go back and listen to us talk about the first Invincible book, I believe. So
Yes.
So yeah, thanks so much for listening, and we will talk to you next time. If you enjoyed the Superhero Cinephiles, then you'll also love my companion podcast, the Superhero Cinephiles Book Club. All my Patreon subscribers get access to this exclusive podcast where I review superhero comics and graphic novels. Not sure what comics you want to read next or what you should dive into? I've got you covered on that. I'll be doing reviews, recommendations, and also talking to you about useful entry points if you're interested in reading some comics but don't know where you should start. Plus, you'll get access to all episodes of the main show a week before everyone else. On all of this for as little as just $1 a month. All you have to do is go to patreon.com/supercinemapod and you can sign up at any subscription amount to get started. Thanks so much for your support, and please don't forget to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you for listening. And as always, good night, good evening. God bless.